Watch Lewis Hamilton as he exits a corner and something subtle begins to happen before the car even reaches full acceleration. The steering wheel starts to straighten, the car is still finishing its rotation, and yet the throttle begins to come back in earlier than you might expect. Not suddenly, not aggressively, but gently and progressively. The engine note rises slightly while the car is still settling from the corner. Most drivers wait a fraction longer before committing to the throttle, making sure the car is perfectly straight before adding power. Lewis Hamilton often doesn't wait that long. Instead, he begins adjusting the throttle earlier, feeding in power while the car is still completing the final phase of the corner. It's a tiny moment that's easy to miss in real time, but telemetry engineers have noticed it repeatedly. Lewis Hamilton often changes the throttle earlier than most drivers, and that tiny difference plays a major role in how the car behaves on corner exit. To understand why this matters, it helps to think about what happens during corner exit in a Formula One car. As the car approaches the apex of the corner, the driver begins preparing for acceleration. At that moment, the car is still dealing with lateral forces because it is turning, while at the same time the driver wants to begin adding longitudinal force by accelerating. These two forces compete with each other. Tires have a limited amount of grip, and that grip must be shared between turning and accelerating. If a driver applies too much throttle too early, the rear tires can lose grip and spin. If the driver waits too long to apply throttle, the car loses valuable acceleration time and the lap becomes slower. The ideal moment is a delicate balance between stability and speed. Most drivers handle this phase cautiously. After reaching the apex, they gradually unwind the steering wheel and wait until the car is almost straight before applying significant throttle. This approach reduces the risk of wheel spin and keeps the rear of the car stable. Telemetry from many drivers shows this pattern clearly. The throttle trace remains low or flat through the apex and only begins rising sharply once the steering angle decreases significantly. This is a safe and effective method, but it is not always the fastest possible approach. When engineers analyze Lewis Hamilton's telemetry, they often notice something slightly different. Instead of waiting until the steering wheel is nearly straight, Lewis often begins adjusting the throttle earlier while there is still some steering angle. The throttle trace begins to rise sooner, but the increase is extremely smooth and controlled. Rather than jumping quickly from low throttle to high throttle, Lewis feeds the power in gradually, sometimes in small increments that match the changing grip available at the rear tires. At first glance, this early throttle change might look risky. Adding power while the car is still turning increases the chance of losing rear grip. But Lewis manages this phase with remarkable precision. Instead of treating the throttle as a simple on and off control, he uses it as a tool to balance the car. By adjusting the throttle earlier and more progressively, he stabilizes the rear of the car during the transition from cornering to acceleration. One of the key reasons this works is weight transfer. When a driver begins accelerating, weight shifts toward the rear of the car. This increases the load on the rear tires and gives them more grip. But if the driver waits too long before adding throttle, the rear tires may remain lightly loaded while the car is still rotating. That can make the rear feel unstable. By introducing throttle earlier, Lewis helps shift some weight toward the rear sooner, increasing stability exactly when the car needs it most. This early throttle adjustment also influences how the car completes its rotation through the corner. Many people assume throttle only affects acceleration, but it also changes how the car balances between front and rear grip. Slight increases in throttle can stabilize the rear and reduce the risk of sudden oversteer. This allows Lewis to maintain confidence while still pushing the car close to the limit of grip. Telemetry often reveals how controlled this process is. Instead of a sudden spike in throttle, Lewis's throttle traces frequently show a smooth, progressive curve. The throttle begins to rise slightly earlier than expected, but the increase is gentle. As the steering angle decreases and the car straightens, the throttle continues rising until full power is applied. The entire process is fluid and synchronized with the car's changing balance. This synchronization is crucial. If the throttle rises too quickly while the car is still turning sharply, the rear tires can lose grip and spin. If the throttle rises too slowly, the driver misses the opportunity to accelerate sooner. Lewis's technique finds the precise middle ground where the rear tires gain grip through weight transfer without exceeding their traction limit. Another benefit of this earlier throttle change is improved corner exit speed. Because Lewis begins feeding in power slightly earlier, the car reaches higher speeds sooner after the apex. Even a small advantage here can make a noticeable difference over the length of a straight. The earlier the car begins accelerating, the more distance it has to build speed before the next braking zone. Engineers sometimes refer to this phase as power application timing. Small differences in timing can translate into measurable lap time gains. In telemetry comparisons, drivers who apply throttle earlier often achieve slightly higher exit speeds, provided they maintain control of the rear tires. Lewis Hamilton's ability to manage this balance consistently is one of the reasons his exits often look smooth and controlled even when operating near the limit. Another interesting aspect of this technique is how it interacts with tire management. Formula One tires are extremely sensitive to heat and stress. Aggressive throttle inputs can overheat the rear tires and reduce grip over time. By feeding the throttle earlier but more smoothly, Lewis spreads the load across the tires more evenly. Instead of shocking the rear tires with a sudden burst of power, he allows them to accept the load gradually. This can help maintain tire performance over longer stints. Onboard footage often reflects this style. Instead of a sudden surge of engine sound when the throttle is applied, the engine note rises progressively. The car accelerates smoothly rather than violently. This smoothness is not simply about comfort or aesthetics, it is about using the available grip as efficiently as possible. Now think about this moment from the driver's perspective. Imagine approaching the apex of a corner at nearly 200 kilometers per hour, knowing that the next straight begins the instant you start accelerating. Would you wait until the car is perfectly straight before adding throttle, or would you begin feeding power earlier like Lewis Hamilton does? Which approach do you think would feel more natural in that situation? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, because different drivers often describe this moment very differently. Another question worth considering is how much confidence this technique requires. To begin adjusting the throttle while the car is still rotating, the driver must trust the rear grip completely. A small misjudgment can result in wheel spin or loss of control. Lewis Hamilton's ability to feel the available grip through the car gives him the confidence to begin this process earlier than most drivers. This sensitivity to grip is one of the defining characteristics of elite Formula One drivers. They constantly interpret feedback from the tires, suspension, and steering wheel. Small vibrations, changes in resistance, and subtle shifts in balance all provide information about how much grip remains. Lewis appears particularly skilled at reading these signals and responding instantly with precise throttle adjustments. Another subtle advantage appears in how the car transitions onto the straight. When the throttle is introduced earlier and smoothly, the car's acceleration curve becomes more continuous. Instead of a delayed burst of power, the car builds speed progressively. This can make the entire exit phase more efficient and predictable. Over the course of a lap, these tiny advantages accumulate. Each corner exit contributes a small amount of additional speed. Over multiple corners, the combined effect can reduce lap time significantly. Even differences measured in hundredths of a second become important in a sport where qualifying margins are often extremely small. There is also a strategic aspect to this technique. During races, drivers must manage tyre degradation carefully. Aggressive throttle use can shorten tyre life, forcing earlier pit stops. Lewis's progressive throttle style allows him to accelerate efficiently without overstressing the rear tyres. This balance between performance and tyre management has been a hallmark of his driving throughout his career. Now here's another question for you. When you watch onboard footage of Formula One cars exiting corners, do you notice how quickly the throttle is applied, or does it all look the same at first glance? It's fascinating how many small details exist in these moments that most viewers never see during a live broadcast. Another interesting point is how this technique interacts with modern Formula One power units. With hybrid systems delivering instant torque, managing throttle input has become even more important. Too much power too early can overwhelm the rear tyres. Smooth and progressive throttle control helps drivers harness that power effectively. Lewis Hamilton's approach fits perfectly with the demands of these powerful hybrid cars. Engineers analyzing telemetry often emphasize that the difference is not simply applying throttle earlier, but applying it differently. The timing, rate of increase, and coordination with steering all work together. When these elements are synchronized correctly, the car accelerates cleanly and efficiently. And this brings us back to the original observation. Lewis Hamilton changes the throttle earlier than most drivers, but he does it with exceptional precision. The early adjustment helps stabilize the rear of the car through weight transfer. The gradual increase in power preserves grip while preparing the car for full acceleration. Telemetry shows that this tiny difference in timing can influence corner exit speed, tyre wear, and overall lap performance. The next time you watch Lewis Hamilton exit a corner, listen closely to the engine note and watch how the car begins to accelerate. That subtle moment when the throttle begins to rise may be earlier than you expect. It may also be one of the reasons his driving style has remained so effective throughout his Formula One career. And now I'd love to hear your opinion. Do you think this earlier throttle adjustment is something other drivers could easily adopt, or is it a skill that requires years of experience to master? And when you watch Lewis Hamilton compared to other drivers, do you notice differences in how they apply throttle on corner exit? Share your thoughts in the comments, because sometimes the smallest details reveal the biggest differences between the fastest drivers in the world.